Ukrainian people who are being slaughtered and terrorized and forced to flee their homeland is to bring this war to an end. Jason Blazakis is the former director of the Counterterrorism Finance and Designations Office at the State Department. He is now professor at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, and he joins me now. Jason, it's great to have you on the show. Thanks so much for making time for us. Should the United States be doing more to bring the war to an end? I mean, what could or should we be doing at this point? Because I could be wrong, but the way that I see it is it's this binary choice whereby if we continue to send more weapons for the Ukrainians to defend themselves, it may not bring about a peaceful end to the war. It may defeat the Russians, but it may come at a great cost for the Ukrainians who are suffering and losing cities and lives by the thousands.
Well, we can expand what we're doing vis-a-vis sanctions. We haven't used every sanction tool at this point. And one of the arguments I made back in March in the LA Times was the possibility of adding the Russian Federation to the state sponsor of terrorism list, further restricting the flow of finance and assets to the Russian Federation. From my perspective, the Russian Federation meets the legal criteria for listing. It's a country that has engaged in assassinations overseas. Obviously, what it's doing in Ukraine is terrorizing Ukrainians every day. And the listing itself was going to have significant impact as well that we can't ignore. And I think it's time for the Biden administration to take into account Zelensky's recent request to add Russia to the Federation to the state-sponsored terrorism. So that's one thing we can do that doesn't up the ante in context of military-related kinetic support.
As I was mentioning there in the setup, the amount of military that we have sent has been basically gone through without so much of debate in Congress. Is it the best use of our energy and resources to be sending this much military aid to Ukraine at this moment in this war?
Well, I think we're at an inflection point in the eastern portion of Ukraine. I think the Donbas situation is becoming increasingly dire. And if the United States doesn't continue that support, I think the Ukrainian efforts are going to collapse in eastern Ukraine. So the Donbas situation, I think, is requiring a plus-up of U.S. military support to the region. And I think we have to be selective about what we provide. I think the Ukrainians need additional S-300 and S-400 air defense systems. There are Soviet-era tanks that could be helpful in the context of the eastern Ukrainian surge by the Russians as well. That could be provided to the Ukrainians as in addition to javelins and other items that we provided before. So there are things we should do. We are at this inflection point, and I think it's important that the international community and the United States inflicts more pain on the Russian Federation for its illegal invasion in Ukraine.
We have heard people warn of World War III. We have people say World War III has officially started or has actually started. Some are saying we are fighting a potentially dangerous proxy war with Russia that is currently underway. Are we fighting a proxy war with Russia? What are the ramifications of us being so deliberate and open about the fact that we are providing these arms, even though, as we saw last week, Russia sending a cable to Washington warning that some of the weapons we are sending risks elevating or escalating tensions?
I think let's be clear. The Russian Federation is using proxies right now in Ukraine. They're using paramilitary groups like the Wagner Group to carry out illegal operations. They have used the Russian Imperial Movement, a white supremacist group, to carry out operations in Donbas region as well. So the Russians are using proxies right now. We cannot ignore that. And I think in the context of the U.S. response, we have to take that into account. And that's another reason why I think the state sponsor of terrorism listing is appropriate. It is a non-military tool that we can use right now to do economic harm to the Russian Federation, because it would have real-world consequences. One example of a consequence is that it could expand the secondary sanctions the U.S. government can place on countries that may be providing economic support to the Russian Federation. Countries like China, for instance, may think twice about providing economic support to the Russian Federation. And I would also add the reputational risk for businesses, private multinational companies to continue to do their business operations in the Russian Federation would also, I think, put a lot of stain in their reputations and could lead to more shuttering of businesses in the Russian Federation. And I think we have hundreds that have decided to stop business, but there's still hundreds more that can make the decision to leave. And I think the state-sponsored terrorism tool would help them make that decision.
Let me get your thoughts, Jason, on negotiations here for a moment. As I was saying, I was questioning whether the U.S. is doing enough to encourage negotiations. But the truth of the matter is, Vladimir Putin does not seem willing or capable of negotiating at this point, and perhaps he's just going through the motions. Do you think it is even possible that Vladimir Putin would be willing to negotiate at this point? And more importantly, does he need to negotiate with Ukraine, or does he need to negotiate with the U.S. about how he gets not just himself and his, cronies or oligarchs, but Russia back into the world financial systems?
Well, he hasn't been serious to this point. One question is whether or not there are tools in the arsenal, economic tools that could bring Putin to the negotiating table. And again, I would argue that the state sponsor of terrorism tool, some may think that's going to have a negative impact on diplomatic relations. It would not allow for the United States and Russia to engage diplomatically. But in my experience at the State Department, we have had other countries like Iran on the state sponsor of terrorism list, North Korea, and many others who have actually wanted to come off that list. So in fact, I would argue that this would be an additional piece of leverage for the Biden administration to use with Putin to essentially incentivize negotiations. And in fact, at this point, we haven't seen that seriousness. So I think we need to explore using this both as a carrot and a stick to bring the Russian Federation to the negotiating table.
All right, Jason Blazakis. Jason, thank you so much for your time. Greatly appreciate your insights and your opinions this evening.